Good afternoon and welcome to Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Hannah Wilson.
Yeah, sorry guys,
We didn't hear you. We didn't hear you, sir. Can you introduce yourself again, Isa? We didn't hear you.
Hold on. Hannah, why don't you continue as I fix my technical problems?
Okay, right, I'm going to start again. So, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion. My name's Hannah Wilson, and my co-host, who's just fixing Twitter and the internet at the moment, is Isa Buencamino. And this afternoon, we are hosting today's webcast. This is the fourth conversation in our pilot series of 12 interviews with leading figures in the diversity and inclusion world. So, you might be asking, what is Fast Forward Diversity? Basically, we're curating a series of conversations that aim to fast forward our D&I orientation. It's about allowing advocates to build from what's already been achieved, to take the agenda to new heights. We believe that by stretching our D&I orientation to a more global perspective, it will enhance our ability to empathise and understand the lived experiences of others, to do something personal about it in a meaningful way. So, Isa, I hope you're with us now. Would you like to introduce this afternoon's guest, please?
How about this? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Isa Buencamino, and I'm finally glad to join you on the webcast. Anyway, I want to introduce Fran. Fran is our guest today. Fran Johnston, somebody I've known for a very, very long time. Fran is a world-renowned scholar, practitioner, author, leadership development expert, author of Resonant Leadership. Can you see this? I've read this so many times. I'm a big fan. Fran works for the company Telios, and their motto is moving leaders who move the world. And Fran has been working with some of the top leaders in the world, whether it's CEO of Fortune 100 companies or even government country leaders like former Khmer Rouge generals in Cambodia. And her expertise is, I would say, several things. She is an expert in systems approach to transformation change on a top-down change approach. She is also, I would say, an expert bottom-up in emotional intelligence. So leaders and how they use emotional intelligence when they drive change. So a lot of angles to her expertise. And so today we're asking her about her experience in driving the diversity inclusion agenda using all of her expertise areas. So welcome, Fran.
Happy to be here. Very, very happy to be here. This is fun.
Well, our first question is, we wanted to ask you, so how did you come about becoming a champion of equity, diversity, and inclusion? I guess the first important question to ask is, why is this agenda important to you?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a super important one because we all need to find what is it in ourselves that drives our attention and passion in the space. So it's an easy answer for me. When I came out as a lesbian and at like 22 years old, which was in the 80s, so I've kind of been around a little while, I was really aware of feeling different and feeling like that I had things to overcome, and that I had my own work to do in terms of what that meant for me as a person, as a worker, as an employee. When I would don the suit, the good old-fashioned ladies' suits of the 80s, it just never fit me, not at all. So I had like every day the sense of, what am I doing? How do I fit in? Do they want me here? Do I want to conform to the rules of the corporation? And at the time, I was working for the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the best business schools in the world. So they were very sure that what they were doing was the right and good and true way. So that was one way for sure.
Thanks, Fran. And Dream, what I'm hearing there is feeling different is also being othered as well, and being made to kind of like stand out, and being made to feel like you haven't got a place or in that kind of space. And I think a lot of the rhetoric at the moment for me around D&I is this getting this balance right between doing the inner work and doing the outer work, because everyone's reacting to doing the outer work, but actually we need to start with the inner work. And I think that links back to what Isa said in your introduction about the emotional intelligence piece. I'm just wondering about your kind of advice on, or the journey that you've walked around doing that inner work piece on your own identity.
That is such an important question, Hannah, and I really appreciate that you're framing this part of this work as that work, right? So starting in the 90s, I did quite a lot, I mean, decades of work in Gestalt. So that meant I put myself in circles of people expressing themselves, and myself learning to express myself, and express myself with people who had very different worldviews than I, and very different life experiences. So then I could have the sensations, you know, the feelings of whatever they were, right? So I really developed my capacity to sit with feelings and to be able to identify, you know, what is mine, what is the context, how do I navigate, you know, how do I make change in the context appropriately and powerfully through my use of self and my use of voice. And along with that came advocacy and allyship and kind of a general, like, what we should all figure out how to have, and what later becomes inclusive climates, right? How do we create inclusive climates, truly inclusive climates beyond just representation? So that probably took 10 years and right in there.
So could you tell us a little bit about then how you translated that personal experience to then your professional life? Because after being, you know, teaching at Wharton, you know, then you became a consultant, you wrote the book, you started working with leaders all over the world. So how did then that translate into your work?
Well, we were well, first of all, I did a doctorate in psychoeducational processes, which many of the educators on this call will recognize as socio behavioral learning, you know, basically the impact of teachers and climates, and what are the series of behaviors that we can teach people, you know, like how to be collaborative, how to manage conflict, how to inspire people. So that later then becomes emotional intelligence. Which in the late 90s was kind of became a very big thing. And so Annie McKee and I were fortunate enough to be, who's a co-author on many books about emotional intelligence, wonderful books, wonderful person. You know, we were lucky enough to be right in the right place at the right time, and started this firm. One of our clients was Unilever, which is where Isa and I met many years ago. Unilever, Merrill Lynch, and the United Nations Development Program, which is where we did work in South Africa, Swaziland, Cambodia, and the Caribbean region, all around teaching leaders to be more self-aware, more capable of leading and managing people using empathy and social awareness through doing their own inner work. So that's how our corporate practice started, along with working in the NGO space.
And just picking up on that, so the inner work, the outer work, the self-awareness, the social awareness, these kind of different lenses through which we look at things. I was watching the documentary Disclosure on Netflix recently. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's a fascinating documentary about the kind of the experience of trans people in America predominantly. And it gave this kind of historical narrative where it went to the same talk show hosts over time, and they were having interviews with trans people, and it showed Oprah Winfrey, for example, as a massive icon and such a massive advocate for marginalized people, but it showed her language changing and her perspective of trans people changing over like 20, 30, 40 years. So just going back to your frame of coming out in the 80s, I just think like the contextual awareness you've navigated through, and the kind of the emerging changes and the rhetoric, taking you back to like, what's your current thinking? So equity, diversity, inclusion are such buzzwords of the moment with everything going on in the world right now. What's your current thinking, and how might that have changed over time for you?
Well, I mean, in many ways, I feel like we're having flashbacks at the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and public health. From the 80s, when I came out, of course, was right in the middle of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and then later into the 90s, where we were doing the work, and into the 2000s. I mean, that pandemic took decades for the world to understand as an issue that affected all people, and not just marginalized people. As long it was only happening to gay men, the world didn't care, frankly. But that's where my activism came from, because many of us did care. So that was an absolute pandemic. I would say, how's my thinking changed? I mean, it's one thing that has definitely become more clear to me in the last decade is the systemic racism, the structural racism in systemic policing and criminal justice in our country, and I would argue in every country. I mean, like, we're just the tip of the spear, so to speak, about many issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The rate of incarceration in the United States has just gone off the charts in the last decade, which I wasn't really aware of in the same way. As a white person, privileged white person, I wasn't paying attention, except that kind of intellectually, I was having a problem with prisons for profit. You know what I mean? I just don't think the two things should sort of fit together, and it's probably never going to be a good combination, and it hasn't been, where we've seen tremendous increases of the number of incarcerations, and in the United States, that looks like Black men. For a long history, if you haven't watched the Netflix show 13th, from the 13th Amendment, you definitely should watch that show, because it really explains the link between slavery, post-slavery, Jim Crow era laws, how things got institutionalized, all the way up till today, when people are being arrested for small things and then held in jail without bond, without bail. Like, they haven't even been proven guilty of anything, and they're held in jail for years if you can't make the bond, which is so antithetical to the way we view ourselves. So as I've been kind of trying to sort that out, that was one thing where I would say my thinking got more pointed. And I happened to be in a hotel during the first round of the Black Lives Matter protests in Charlotte. Happened to be in a hotel working with major city police chiefs the day of one of the first Black Lives Matter protests. I guess it must have been about 5 years ago now. So I thought to myself, well, and the protest is happening right downstairs in my hotel. So I'm like, I got to go see this. And so I went down into the protest, and it was so clear, the desperation of the communities of color. I mean, so clear. If you go to a protest and they don't become an intellectual exercise, but you actually feel them and protest, right? So I feel very strongly that we should have a just and fair society that serves all people. I believe in the dream of America. And then you feel these communities who are so clearly disadvantaged isn't even the right word, like systematically kept out.
So, Fran, I want to ask you this question. It is so clear, right? It feels so clear what the problem is. And yet, as you say, things really haven't changed. Things are not changing. Why is it so difficult? So I'm asking you, as a systemic view, system change expert, why is it so bloody hard?
That comes down to one word, and only one word in my view, and it's power. Power. So people who have power don't like to give it up. And conscious and unconscious, that's where this is complicated. It's complicated, and it's fairly straightforward. Like, I do think we're making progress, because we're raising awareness around, especially right now in the United States, around kind of real systemic impediments to access to all kinds of things, and how the rules of the game are kind of set up. So the rules of the game are set up to continue the opportunity for certain classes, white people predominantly, whether they feel that we are, it's done on our behalf or not, it is easier for us to get mortgages. We are less likely to get arrested. We can be able to live in, more more enriched communities that make it possible for our children to have more opportunities without even thinking about it. So, and why? Because the system is sort of set up to try to create an inequitable society for reasons of profit, I would guess. I mean, let's go back to prisons just for a second. The US has 5% of the world's population right now in the world. We have 5% of the population, and yet, amazingly, we have 25% of the world's prisoners. I mean, that's disproportionate. It doesn't make sense. We're not that criminal. Like, as people, we're not doing that many bad things. It's just not what happens. Humans don't really do that many bad things. See my thoughts about emotional intelligence. So there's something else at play, and what that something else is a for-profit system that needs prisoners in order to, make money, in order to sell shares to create profit. So, like, that would be an example of how it's not helpful. Same thing with education, in the United States, where there's been quite a movement towards privatizing education. That does not necessarily end up with equality, not at all. Right.
And that's where I was going to go with my next question, actually. So thinking about the systemic barriers, the systemic racism, the systemic inequity and injustice that we know is prevalent in society, we're not just talking in corporate worlds, we're talking about education as well. And I know you're in the States and I'm in the UK, but we have got issues with disproportionate numbers of BAME boys, for example, being excluded. I'm just wondering what's the kind of the lens over in the States when it comes to education in particular and social justice and social equity within the education system?
Well, I think that's one place that's really waking up like quickly right now, thanks to the Black Lives Matter protests and really putting social equity in the front of us for the last 5 years, and then kind of post George Floyd era. The murder of George Floyd that was then put on TV for everybody to watch really woke up quite a lot of white people. I mean, some of my Black friends joke, like suddenly all these whites have woken up and like they didn't imagine that there was such a thing as racism until like last week, and luckily people are waking up. And so into that then goes in questions about curriculum, like what's actually being taught in our schools. In the last 20 years in the United States, there's been a concerted effort to remove issues of slavery, like any acknowledgement of slavery as a exploitative system from our history books. So you have lots of people in the United States who don't think that slavery actually existed. And then when people say, Black people say anything about slavery, they are, that ilk of white people say they're like making it up and they're complaining and they should get over it. And what about it anyway, right? So it really lowers the level of the sophistication of the discourse, if you will. When we have to let's go back and try to prove historical fact. So anyway, I think education is really looking at what are we teaching and who's teaching children. I, for one, want my children to be, I have one child who's of color and another child who's Caucasian of a different color. I want them both to be taught by leaders, by teachers. And I want them to be led when they go to the workplace by people that are different from them, have different worldviews. So we are limited if we are only white teachers in white schools with white children and brown and Black children and Asian children, of course, and different kinds of children. But if you have only white teachers and white principals, you're going to get a white worldview taught. And that is one of the systemic ways of keeping a narrative kind of controlled, like a way of looking at the world controlled. By doing the work, if I go back to my work, the work in Cambodia, it really changed my worldview. First of all, by getting there and working there for a while and realizing I really have no idea what it's like to be a Cambodian. And that, luckily I'm like, oh, okay, I have really no idea. And I'm not trying to say, be like me. That's how emotional intelligence can help you, or Gestalt training or things like that, to be able to recognize and not that there are things that I don't know. And I don't need to be rigidly attached to my wisdom somehow, prop up my ego or something, but actually be more curious and open and inclusive to find out how what I think fits with how other cultures operate.
Thank you, Fran. There's so much I want to unpack there from an educator's point of view. So the kind of the what we teach, the how we teach it as well, and the who's doing the teaching. So we're going through a bit of an emerging curriculum reform where the rhetoric over here since George Floyd's murder, with it being so high profile, like you say, no one can ignore it anymore. We know this has been an issue for a long time, but because it has been during a pandemic, during a lockdown, on social media, so public, so high profile, that we've got people who have perhaps hidden or been ignorant can no longer hide because it's so visible. So we've now got this kind of like emerging reactivity to anti-racist education, decolonizing the curriculum. But I think my question to you in the States, being further ahead than us, is like, what's the training? Like, how are teachers trained to actually do this work? Because actually, like, I think that isn't that part of the problem, that we're expecting there to be this collective wisdom, but we've got predominantly white teachers then diversifying the curriculum through their white worldview. So I'm just wondering about the kind of the how do you challenge that as a training opportunity, perhaps for educators?
It's a great question. And I think that's another thing there's another thing in here that's really changed in the last 20 or 30 years. We have access to so much information now with Google, right? And with Netflix and different learning styles. And you can really educate yourself as a white person so easily now. You cannot say, oh, I don't know what to teach. So that's one thing. There's access to information, and teachers are smart people. So I raise my bar for them. Like, come on, we can do it. Second thing is to work together. And I think in white-only spaces, we need some space to be really messy, because we are messy. And as soon as we bring in people of color, we start to perform or be worried about how we're going to be experienced, or not say what we're really thinking because we don't want to be judged. And we can get judged by other kind of liberal progressive white people too. I mean, I think we really need to slow down. I love to say it, slow down to speed up. Slow down, sit together, feel the feelings, feel the commitment emerge from realizing we have something that we have to change, and we need to figure out how to do it. And it's our job to figure out how to do it, and not always, as we would have in the past, sort of brought in the trainer, the Black or brown trainer, and had them tell us what to do. Now, you should pay Black and brown trainers to tell you what to do, also, but don't just have that be an abdication of, as if we can't figure this out at all ourselves. Because there's all kinds of stuff where I feel oppressed as a white person by some of the things which we teach. So, I don't have to go far to figure out what it's like to be, not included or not represented. Do you know what I mean? That's the link between the personal and the professional. Everybody feels included somehow.
So I want to follow that up with a question on going back to what you said earlier about power. And when I ask you, why is it so difficult for people and systems to change, right? So some of the things that we've said, it's so obvious now. Education is key. We have to educate ourselves. I mean, these are the things that are we know. No one needs to tell us, right? It's kind of like intuitively you kind of know, but changing, so personally changing and encouraging change in a system. I mean, how would you advise? What is the best way of doing that? So you have coached and you have worked with very powerful white men, in positions that can create real change. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how you would encourage leaders to let go of this power so that change can happen? I mean,
well, let me say that one of the things I've learned in 30 years of working with very senior executives is they often want the change. Like they really wanted. I mean, if we think back to some that we knew in common, they have set out to their organizations, let's create more inclusive and diverse organizations because it's good for business. So, I mean, the business case has been clear for decades. at least since the 90s when I was started working in the space. So the very senior people are like, well, why wouldn't we do it, right? It's good for business, and we know heterogeneous teams get better results. Then they're setting the bar for their systems. Then what happens is that the system, the people that have to like make the change happen, they either resist or get confused themselves or think it's too difficult, it's too emotional, and then they give up. And so that's one reason why you want more diverse people into senior management roles, so that they can, they with the commitment, the steady-eyed commitment, can kind of keep pushing the agendas forward. And it's the other reason why we have to kind of keep working on the majority white population that isn't feeling the issue. And when we don't feel an issue, this is the link back to Gestalt again, we can often let go to sleep. We can let it fall away, right? We can get seduced into thinking that small acts are good enough. And they aren't, right? Actually, systemic change takes it takes years on commitment, and it takes a series of courageous moves. So even when we think in multinational companies, like we did a lot of work with one of your flag crown jewel companies a couple of years ago all over the world. And the question there is like promoting local nationals. So we know that people were good. Local national people could do the jobs, but the nervousness came from what would London or Houston think about me promoting that person who's a different other into this senior manager role or to lead a major project or something like that. So the issue was not happening about the person and the relationship between the expat and the local leader. They understood that this job could be done. The real issue came when the expat executive had to think back to headquarters and wonder how committed headquarters really was to the diversity and equity and inclusion agenda. Would they be committed enough to let me actually promote or put in charge of very highly visible projects, which is how you get the reputation in complex systems to being able to be promotable. But if you've never been seen as that, you never get promoted. Your name never comes up. So to me, I am fascinated by just how relational those decision moves are, right? So you need the compulsion of the senior leaders, the executives saying, yes, we will, yes, we must. Where are my numbers? Show me some people. And you also need the courage and commitment of the senior executives, like one level down and a level down below that, who are saying committed from the heart because they really know and love that local leader, and they know that person should get a shot.
I mean, the thought when you said, yes, we understand this is the right thing to do, business leaders, let's do this. And then it hits the fan. And then you realize, gosh, this is not a commute. It's a journey. It's a really long journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
And would you agree? I mean, leadership resilience is one of the key traits in doing this piece of work. Like I've been doing this for as long as I've known you, Fran, 20 years. And I have to admit, after 20 years, I was already losing the will. And it's hard to just keep at it. It's like trying to destroy a wall with a pencil. It really requires a lot of will. So how would you? Is there anything that you can say about leadership development or resilience development that, for us who's trying to make a difference here, that we could work on ourselves so that we can have that resilience to go for, the marathon?
Well, first of all, Isa, I would say that it's important that our advocates and leaders of color take care of themselves. That actually your work might not be to be more resilient, but to be able to renew and recharge and recruit some others to do the work, but not always to be the one out in front, because it will burn you out, because it is stressful. It is stressful to be a person of color in corporations or in institutions of education, flat out, without even trying to drive change. And then when you add doing your leadership job, and then add to that doing social change with a bunch of unconscious or conscious people, then, we're really putting too much burden on the people of color. So what we need to do in our leadership development programs is make sure that we have built-in spaces where we are not, first of all, not inadvertently re-traumatizing with our discourse, with the words that we say, the people of color who are in the mix, right? That's another thing, Hannah, to go back to your question about what's changed in my worldview from the last 20 years, is I've been really blessed to have a dear friend and colleague, Gretchen Schmelzer, who's written books about long-term trauma and the impact of long-term trauma on learning and growth and people. So when I took that and integrated it into my diversity, equity, and power lens, it really helped me kind of bring to the forefront, along with my colleague, Ray Fisher, the forefront of who's a man of color. We have to really take care of the Black and brown people. And you could add a list of other different othered, but in the American context, and right now, you got to say race number one, right? So those advocates need to take care of themselves. We need to create space in our leadership development and coaching practices for people of color to get the care and support that they need so that they can persist. And then we need to simultaneously take space in these leadership development programs, which we always have at Telios Leadership Institute, of putting diversity and inclusion and power and equity in the forefront and talking explicitly, not just about unconscious bias, but about bias, right? This flat out bias, which goes back to some of the scenarios I was talking about earlier in our client examples, to create space for ethical dilemmas. Like, how do I manage this, my tension with headquarters and my tension with trying to make the right call for this local national? It's not so simple as just that person being biased, right? Which we need to not have a simplistic frame about these things. That's where emotional intelligence really helps, because that guy in Azerbaijan or Egypt wanted to make the right call, but he also knew that if he sent that local national back to Houston to work on a project, it wasn't going to be easy at all. So, what does he do, And you can't solve that. He can't solve that just by himself. He needs to be able to have a courageous and open conversation with that local national about ambition and what would it really mean to take that secondment to, headquarters as a person of color.
Fran, this is so rich. I've got so many questions I want to ask you. I want to look back to what you said a minute ago. So one of the phrases you used a minute ago was about leaders being committed from the heart. Some of the language of leadership over here is like ethical leadership, values-based leadership is quite big in education. Heart-based leadership is a phrase that's kind of emerging more. Is that part of the problem as well, that actually people are committing from the head rather than the heart, perhaps? And actually it's about the heart-driven decision-making processes, behaviours, about this being, that's what social justice is, isn't it? It comes from the heart. I just wanted you to sort of tease that out a little bit more.
Great question. I have been fortunate to do D&I work and a lot of other different kinds of work in the UK. So I know well your love of the intellect as the way through. And the problem with that is it's a reasoning style, you know what I mean? It's an intellectual exercise. And when it comes to this dilemma, like I've been painting that one of these leaders had, it was really an emotional dilemma. It wasn't an intellectual dilemma. So learning to lead from your heart, to trust your heart. And in kind of the language of emotional intelligence, we would talk about empathy, and we would talk about organizational awareness in the sense of social awareness and your own values. Like, my heart is where my values lie. If I'm aware of my own personal set of values, then I know I feel better when I'm able to execute from that space, when I'm able to lead from that space. If I'm disconnected from my own values, or it turns out my values have some unconscious bias to them, like my value is that really all teachers should be white because white people are smarter than people of color, now I have a problem, right? So that's the kind of private work that we need to do with ourselves to reconcile, like, what is that? How are our values how am I really living my values, and not have them be espoused values like equity for all. But then if I look at my behavior, it's actually I'm not making choices that are revealing that I'm living from that value. Instead, I have an espoused value versus a heartfelt expressed value. And to live your expressed values, to make decisions day in and day out as a leader from your expressed values is very much harder. That's a journey. Like Isa said, that's the marathon. And it really starts with, what do I really care about, right? I mean, at the end of the day, what kind of leader do I want to be? How do I want to be remembered? And if you want to be remembered as a person that made space for others, people of color, disadvantaged people, then, then you got to make the space. You got to make it happen. And most people do, actually, if they kind of slow down and get in touch enough. I mean, most of us progressives that would be on this call likely, get in touch enough with what do we really care about? Then it's leadership. Then it's about leadership, followership, and teammateness, colleagueness, like the 180. Like, what do we do to actually help people get heard in a meeting? Small behaviors of inclusion, as well as the big ones.
And just to pick up this kind of idea of spaces, white spaces, inclusive spaces. So some of the language that I'm hearing is kind of like who's present, who's absent, who's visible, who's invisible. And I'm just thinking about the visibility, linking back to the systemic things you're talking about, the local and the national, or the micro and the macro kind of systems. That just really makes me think about the education system in the UK, because we've become quite fragmented. Our schools have been academised. Our academies belong to these big trusts of schools. So you might have a school, an academy and a trust with quite a diverse staff body, but your point there about the relationship on the ground versus the relationship at HQ and who is visible within that hierarchical organisational structure, that's just really struck me that's part of the problem. We've got a kind of a trusteeship and a governance model here, which is very male, pale and stale. So you might have a brilliant black teacher, Asian, middle leader in an academy, but if there's like 4 stratas of pale, male and stale above you, and the decision-making power sits further up the chain, how can we make the people doing the work be more visible? Are there any techniques there about kind of like visibility, raising profile, amplifying people's work when it's not being seen and it's not being heard?
That's a great question. I would say that representation is necessary but insufficient, right? So definitely necessary but insufficient. We must get more diverse executive leadership ranks. We just have to. And as I was saying to Isa, we can't think that that's enough, because then it puts it all on the people of color or the represented other to kind of be advocating all the time. And the more that one person advocates, the less people listen to them, which is another problem. So that's why everybody's got to be on the agenda. Otherwise, that one person is sort of harping on, oh, here comes the person. She's going to talk about diversity and inclusion. Even before Fran opens her mouth, we know what she's going to say, blah, 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 blah. Right. So, like, it's good. We got to keep advocating, but, we need genuine, we need to recruit some others. But for the kind of elevation piece, I think that's an interesting question. Leadership is a very personal reflection. So for everybody, that's another thing, back to the leadership development question, like, we need to invite people to leadership, to believe that they can lead, to believe that they should be in the space, to believe that it's going to make a difference, because many people who are making a difference in the classroom or making a difference at the kind of more local level are pretty ambivalent about joining headquarters. And sometimes headquarters doesn't like to hear that, right? Because they think everybody wants to be part of them. But sometimes headquarters is really stifling. It's a stifling place to be. And people don't feel like they're actually making a difference, different other people, right? That we all think should want to go into the executive ranks. So executive ranks, headquarters, has to make more inclusive climates for themselves. They really do. Like, they have to just, and that's happening in the United States right now. Foundations are starting to question their belief systems. There's really some amazing work coming out of the arts. Some of the arts foundations really fundamentally questioning museums, for instance, like where they put art and who's on their board, and how they could rethink lots of what they're doing. So those kinds of questions should be happening, I think, in any executive suite, because mostly when we're in the executive suite, we don't know what we don't know. And Isa knows well from her corporate life how limiting the discourse can become. In Becoming a Resident Leader, we talk about it as the CEO disease. Like, CEOs don't get feedback. People in power don't get feedback because everybody else is afraid to give them any feedback. So I've met many of them on the other side going like, I'd love some feedback. My door's open. How come nobody talks to me? And, you know, the answer is always because you're the big guy. You know, even if you're the woman, like, people are afraid. So they're not going to just walk in there. And now this may be changing with our millennials and our Black Lives Matter protests. People are walking right into the suite now. And now that, you know, people in the headquarters are kind of on their back foot because suddenly they're getting a lot of feedback. But prior to that, by the time they got feedback about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it had been sanitized and intellectualized and turned into charts. It was dehumanized. And so now, you know, now it's very human. The conversation has switched like completely from analytic to like raw emotion, which is going to present its own challenges as a change agent, OD consultant, you know, that I am, about how to now integrate these two paradigms, you know, the intellectual, like goals-based, measurement-based, and the kind of passion for change must happen, and the raw emotion of what you hear when you're an executive right now, what people are hearing for the first time, and it is confronting their values, because many of them, as I said before, actually would like their organization to be more inclusive. And then they're now getting feedback saying it's not what you think.
So Fran, right? So what you're saying, I think what you're saying is, for real change to happen, leadership, we have to redefine what leadership is and who is the leader. So effectively, everyone can be a leader for this agenda, right? So whether you are the CEO, the next level down, people on the ground, and all that, people have to step up in their leadership if change is going to happen. But the paradigm there is the issue you said earlier about people's reluctance to give away power. I mean, how do you, it feels like, you know that, okay, you have to give away the power so that change can happen, yet you don't want to give away because it's not in your DNA to do it. I mean, how do you fix that?
Well, it's a zero sum, like, people have zero sum game thinking, and it's just, I just don't believe that. Like, as if, you know, somebody gets it and somebody loses it. It's not that mechanical. I think there's plenty of space to bring more people to the table. I think what we're really talking about is, both in the short run, medium term, and long term, is redefining our construct about what leadership is and where it's happening. Because it's happening right now on the ground, as you said. It's also formal leadership, you know, that gets where the decisions get made. The Hamilton, the room where it happens, right? So, you know, we want more people to be in the room where it's happening, and kind of those people, when they get there, no matter what color they are, to not get seduced into the game of keeping things exactly the way they are. But now you're in the executive and we'll pay you $1 million, right? So it's really about that systemic change, right? That's my point about representation is necessary but insufficient. We have to really think about how can we fairly pay all people? What are our policies, right? And not just rely on an exploitative system, for instance.
As an English teacher, I'm obsessed with like words and labels and language. One of the questions that's come up is part of the problem the fact that we have multiple definitions of what inclusion is. So what one leader thinks an inclusive approach is different to another one. And I know as a woman, quite a feisty woman working in all male senior leadership teams, some of my male colleagues thought that they were he for she, and they weren't he for she. Their behaviours and their language and just some of their decisions were completely un-he for she. And is that part of the problem, that actually we need to go back to like word level and definitions about what do we actually mean by diversity? What does diversity and inclusion and equity look like for us in this space? What does it look like for me as a leader, you as a leader? Going back to your point about the kind of the courageous conversations, do we need to almost start at the beginning about the language we're using to then frame
Maybe.
this activity?
I mean, yes, common language, I would say, is always helpful. Always helpful. My part response to you is that inclusion is an experience. It's a felt experience. So like we need to make our charts and tell people like what it looks like and what are the behaviors that they should do, for sure. And then we need to like help each other do those behaviors. And then the outcome will be an environment that feels inclusive. Again, if we aren't giving feedback, or if our way of saying, hey guys, hey women, I don't feel like you're listening to me, is like that is a micro behavior where everybody needs to then stop and be like, oh, okay, wait, that's not what we want, right? So we need people to speak up, and we need people to try to practice the behaviors, and then just also have some compassion for everybody, courage and compassion that people are trying, and not kind of, I really don't like the whack-a-mole version of, oh, you messed up, you, I want to like point at you, because then people get very defensive. And they don't want to try again. Then they go back and they're like, okay, well then you lead the meeting. I don't know what to do. And then we have a leadership crisis because nobody wants to step in. There are no perfect spaces because we're humans. And actually from a Gestalt perspective, that's where the space of tension, creativity, is creativity. The space of like, I'm trying and you're trying, and we come together and we miss each other a little bit, and then we slow back down and we try to figure out how to do it better or different, and out of that comes better or different. So I want to like try. I want to get in, and then I want people to meet me there and not just judge me for for the way I messed up. Because and then if you get into trauma histories, back to what I was saying earlier, it can be very challenging at the very emotional level for everybody, what the dominant group as well as the oppressed group. And so I think we should honor its complexity right there in that space and try to learn those good behaviors about, which is very idiosyncratic. Who are we as a team? I am not just a representation of a white woman and a lesbian woman. I am Fran Johnston with my history. You guys are who you are with your histories, which are inclusive of your identities. So I think that is another opportunity, because then we can get into transformation for everyone. That's what's in it for everybody. Everybody gets to grow.
I think my favorite expression, it's like a tide that rises. All boats get to go up, right? I wanted to ask you about how to try, micro behavior. So how I want to ask you an example of how would you recommend a person handles a situation in which someone makes a sexist, racist, homophobic, prejudiced remark, for somebody who receives it or somebody who sees it happen, speaking from emotional intelligence, I mean, how would you recommend people should start behaving when something like that happens?
Well, the first thing is to do a timeout and to say, timeout. I'm absorbing some feelings about what you just said, which takes courage in meetings, because everybody wants to get the task done, and who has time for that? So, and for introverts, it's also like practically almost everybody. It's hard to like hear the thing and jump on it as fast as the pace of a meeting can go. So that's one thing. One thing we do as a sort of an antidote to that is to make sure that we are doing check-ins, like a routine of having everybody speak at the beginning and hopefully at the end and somewhere along the line, so that people are used to speaking and being heard, and we're used to speaking and hearing everybody, so that you prepare the ground, so to speak, for when somebody has an offense, then we can stop the process and kind of listen to that. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think it's really helpful when people own in an I statement. Like, I feel what you said, the way what you just said is impacting me is it's making me feel anxious, or it's making me feel angry, or it's making me feel invisible, which is why people need to be emotionally intelligent everywhere so that they know what it's making them feel. Because that's a very different statement than like, I caught you, you've aggrieved, you've messed up. Then people become kind of the diversity police. And I think that's not very helpful either, really.
That's great feedback, and it really resonates with me as an educator, as a leader. We check in with the kids all the time. Checking in with staff is something we do, but during the pandemic and during lockdown, I think check-ins have perhaps become more part of our cultural kind of like practice in teams, and I hope that actually stays. And a phrase I've used before, like rather than calling it out in the meeting, I will quite often say to someone, "How did you intend to make me feel when you said that?" And they hate it because it puts them on the spot, but it reflects it back on. It asks them to articulate it to me rather than me to say, "I'm really angry because," or "You've made me feel like this." So I've found that quite powerful sometimes. One of our listeners has asked a question as well, like, what is the best way to deal with challenge that is saying our work in inclusion is political, particularly when you're a person of colour and the work you're doing is around racism and it becomes politicized? How do you challenge that and sort of like frame it and not let it become about identity politics, I guess?
Well, that's a hard question. Well, I guess my first answer is, in many ways this is political, right? If we go back to power, right? I mean, I'm not political in the sense of parties, although of course that's the way it's currently being held or understood. But we are talking about the distribution of power. We are talking about whose agenda gets listened to. So, I mean, part of the, I guess it's the Gestaltist to me would say, like, that's the what is. I mean, the what is we're trying to say that we want more space for all the reasons that we talked about earlier in the call, for good business reasons, good learning reasons. If you want to educate all children and you are being measured on how all your outcomes are, you need to create inclusive spaces because we know that works better. So, you can tie it to the business case and say, I'm sorry that you really are framing it that way, because it immediately takes us into as if I don't need to listen to you because you're a Democrat or you're a Republican in the United States, which is not at all what we're trying to, that's not, we're in this together. You know what I mean? It shouldn't be agendaized in that way. But let me just say that back to when I said about what gets taught in our curriculums, that is very much a partisan worldview, that we should erase slavery from our curriculums and therefore the children will not know that slavery happened. I mean, what is that? But one group wanting to tell a narrative in a way that makes them feel more comfortable. And then using their positional power, school boards, elected places who approve curriculums, positional power to put their agenda into play. I mean, that's leadership, which is why we need leadership. I don't know if that's a good answer, Hannah, but
it's a great answer because there is no perfect answer. That's the thing, isn't it? And I think, like you said, let's stop shying away from it being political, because it is political. I just wanted to go back to your context of being a global leader. I'm really fascinated to know from your insight of working in so many different countries, so many different cultures, what are some of the key learning points that you've experienced, and perhaps the things that have been the most starkly different, but also the things that have been the same no matter where you are? I'm just interested in that kind of international lens.
One thing that is true everywhere is this power dynamic, right? There are elites in every country, and then there are non-elites in every country. And the gap between the two can be different. That's one thing around the world, is just how mobile the society is. And that has some interesting implications for some of the work that we've done in leadership development about mindset, about whether people really think that they could ever be part of the executive suite. If you have a worldview, if you've internalized a worldview and been told across, generations and centuries and eons that your people are less than it's a very Western idea to believe that suddenly you can change your reality, right? So it's a Western idea, but not that it can only happen in the West, but it's a mindset. So that's one thing we saw when we were doing some of our international work, is how people they had to, like in Cambodia or South Africa, different tribes, different angles of where people were coming from. They had to they could totally relate to emotional intelligence, because everybody has emotions. Everybody has relationships. Everybody has power dynamics. Everybody has inclusion and exclusion dynamics and has feelings about that. So they just had to reconfigure it for their own worldview, right? And that was exactly what we wanted them to do. So what does empathy look like in the various countries? And then how do you use empathy as a source of data? That's why it's called intelligence. A source of data with which you might act, right? And when you really slow that down, then that really helps societies and cultures kind of take care of one another, because we're effectively tribal mammals anyway. So how are we taking care of our most vulnerable, most disenfranchised is a measure, I think, of health. It's a way you can look to see how we're doing. How are we doing as a society?
Right. I think it's almost time's up. Hannah, can't believe it's gone by really, really quickly. So just to close off the webcast, is there what is the final takeaway that you want our viewers to know or take away from this conversation?
I would like people to learn to keep in mind the humanity of each individual, while also advocating for groups. So that, the I and the we. I would like people to take in what I said about the measure of the success or health of your community or your institution or your country being somehow revealed by how the least fortunate amongst you are cared for. For what you said, Isa, that actually we are all elevated in a spiritual way when we are all operating from our most humane sense of self. And that is an evolution. That is a developmental trajectory, that not everybody starts in the same place, even in this lifetime. But let's take this lifetime, that we can have compassion for people wherever they're starting the journey, and call them in, and put an arm around them and say, come on, we can do this. And we can hold ourselves to continued growth and courageous leadership in this space. That we have to kind of do it together, or we get fractured and everything falls apart, and it becomes very painful, very stressful work. But if it's a call in, and it's going to be good for everybody, and yes, we can do this, yes, we can, together, I'll help you, and you help me, then I think that's the way we make for lasting transformational change, because everybody's committed to it.
Hannah, how about you? And what's your takeaway?
I think my takeaway, I'm just really mulling over this word power, and the quote that lots of people use, that knowledge is power. And I'm wondering whether that's part of what we need to reframe, that actually diversity and inclusion is power. And if the people with power, the people with white power, actually saw diversity and inclusion as amplifying and increasing their power, would they look at it differently? So I'm just thinking about the kind of the reframe around this word power. So I haven't got anything succinct at the moment. I'm going to go away and think about it more, but that's kind of where I'm at. And it's been an absolute privilege to listen to you this afternoon, Fran. Thank you so much for joining us from Philadelphia. There's lots and lots of lovely comments on the feed about how moving the conversation's been. So I've learnt loads. Thank you so much. How about you, Isa? What's your takeaway? I know you've known Fran for a long time, but perhaps you've learnt something new today, or you've rediscovered something?
I think for me, it's the emphasis, a reminder, emphasis about the importance of compassion and leadership, and not just compassion for other people, but compassion for yourself. And I'm thinking about people who are driving the D&I agenda, the few of us who are lucky enough to be in position to represent that diversity group in a position where we can push for change, that the importance of having compassion for yourself and really taking the time to make sure that you're okay too, because it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It takes a long time. You really have to take care of yourself. And in the same thread of compassion, it's really, if you want to make change, you have to create the space for the dialogue for it. So the check-ins that we're having now, as because of what COVID's done to us, right, to carry that on, because you really need a timeout in meetings, whether it's in education or in business, where you have to like pause and ask the question, okay, we're done talking about business, can we talk a little bit about how we interacted as human beings, and really create that space in every conversation so that change really does start to happen. So yeah, compassion. Right, I think that's it. Hannah, do you want me to say something about our next speaker?
Yes, please. If you can explain what's happening for the next 2 weeks so people understand the context of the next 2 episodes, please.
I just want to say thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Fran. Right. So for the next 2 episodes, we have the next guest we have is Sarah Dolman. So Sarah is an LGBTQ plus advocate, and a lot of her work has been about raising awareness around that. Sarah is a senior lecturer. She's a teacher governor at a further education college. But previously, she was also director for the charity the Terence Higgins Trust. And I don't know whether you guys have heard about this, but this is the UK's leading HIV and sexual health charity that supports people living with HIV. So our next guest, which is August 6th, I don't know, what date is it? I said August 6th, yes. 6? I'm looking at Hannah. Sorry, August
it's
2.
next Sunday.
Yes. Sorry. So Sarah Dolman. And then after that, our next guest after that is Fajri Bibi, who is a community leader from the Midlands. And she represents, I guess, an Asian community in the Midlands. And she will talk to us about her lived experience of trying to create change within that context. That's it.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Lovely comments, and please do follow Fran's work, Twitter and LinkedIn, and buy her book. Take care. Enjoy your evening.